Hello, physical geographers. So last chapter of Geography 112, Physical Geography, Climate and Weather. So last chapter we talked about the biosphere, and we talked about flora and fauna. Flora being vegetation, plant life, and fauna being animal life. So we're going to go into more details on that. Okay, so we have different ecosystems, different biomes of scale for all geographers. Fauna and flora, we talked about those. Different variations, we're going to go into detail on that. Another breakdown of biomes in addition to fauna. Major biomes: desert, Mediterranean woodlands, shrub, mid-latitude grassland, deciduous forest, mid-latitude, boreal forest, tundra. And then we're going to look a little bit at human modification of the biosphere: physical removal, organisms, habitat modification, introduction of exotic species, loss of biodiversity. Okay, so ecosystems, really an interaction community of plant and animals between organisms and the environment. Biome, we can define that as a large, recognizable assemblage of plants and animals, so flora and fauna. Ecotone, transition zone of competition between species. So sometimes we have species vying for the same food supply and resources. Terrestrial flora, essentially we have visual components of landscapes, indicators of attributes, influence on human settlement. So once again, we're looking at the human impact. On plants, we have perennials, survive seasonal fluctuations, annuals perish during climatic stress. We have heard of those with gardens or planting flower gardens or vegetable gardens and so forth. So we have two types of reproductive categories: seed producers, gymnosperms, carry seeds in cones, angiosperms, flowering plants, and then spore producers. The counter to seed producers, we have bryophytes like mosses and liverworts, and then we have pteridophytes like ferns and horsetails. So we have structures and features of plants too. Evergreen trees, we see a lot of that in Colorado. Deciduous, undergo annual die-off of leaves, broadleaves, flat, expensive leaves, and needle leaves. We see some of that in Colorado. We have hardwoods and softwoods in Colorado. We usually have softwoods. Got some environmental adaptations. Plants have different tolerance to survival, span tolerance limits when they're stressed. They can basically adapt to low or high water availability. Xerophytic adaptations. Features allow certain plants to withstand protracted dry conditions. So this is desert, semi-arid, or also arid climates. Hydrophytic. Terrestrial plants adapt to very wet environments. There's also a method of growing vegetables, fruits called hydroponics. So it fits in with this, growing or living heavily in water or immersed in water. Okay, so hydrophytes specifically adapted to live immersed in water. Generally, hygrophytes require frequent water soaking, so they're not immersed. We have different global distribution of plants based on where they are throughout the world. Here's a map that shows that nicely. Major plant associations: forests, woodlands, shrublands, and grasslands. And we also have deserts, which we talked about, arid, not much water. And we have vertical zonatation. So basically zonation, horizontal layering of plant associations. And then essentially right here we can see the tree line that we looked at earlier in our course. And we see different effects on elevation. Different vegetation can exist in different areas. So that basically implies that how much oxygen and how much water they need and what the soil and the ground needs to be like. We have vertical zonation also. See that by looking at a profile here. We have local variations: exposure to sunlight. Sometimes we'll see trees on one side of a mountain and not on the other. Adret sun-facing slopes tend to be warmer, drier, urbac. Shaded slopes, cooler with more vegetation, usually smaller vegetation. And we have valley bottom locations, riparian streamside growth. Some vegetation does really well with that. One of the things we see in Colorado that the moose like very much is we frequently see willow trees along river valleys that like moist water, so that's a good example of that. Okay, like moisture near water, I should say. Then we have terrestrial fauna, less prominent plants on the landscape. Characteristic of animals, a variety of animals. Two truly characteristics, capable of self-generated movement, need plants or other animals for sustenance. Okay, so terrestrial fauna. Invertebrates, 90%. Arthropods like insects, crustaceans are included. Also worms, sponges, moths, and then beetles alone are 40% of all insects, 25% of all known mammals. So there's a lot of beetles. We also had a issue with the pine beetle in Colorado several years ago. If we go drive up into the mountains, say we go near Winter Park, or go west on I-70, we'll see the pine beetle kill many trees that were killed in Colorado. We see them about everywhere. Terrestrial fauna, vertebrates, animals with spines to protect the main nerve or spinal cord, find principal groups, fishes, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. Okay, mammal groups, placentals grow and develop in mother's body. I had marsupials, smaller group, nurture their young. Mammals, you can see the example of the moose on the left. We can see marsupials in the middle here, most primitive egg-laying monotremes we can see on the right here. Terrestrial fauna, physiological adaptations, endotherms are warm-blooded animals. Okay, certain animals that can't control their body temperature by storing glucose. That's what those are. Okay, fish fall into that example. Behavioral adaptations. See migration, hibernation, estivation. Migration, periodic movement, usually following the weather and food. Hibernation, spending winter in a dormant condition. Estivation, inactive state during dry, hot periods. So basically just kind of locked down, or shut down, I should say. Reproductive adaptations, delay mating, can delay stages of reproductive cycle, longer period of care. So we do see some of that reproductive adaptations in 2011-12, when we had really warm periods. We saw moose and bears not reproduce in Colorado, and then the following years they reproduced at twice the rate. Okay, here's an example: animal adapting to desert life. Live underground, nocturnal, conserve water, do several things. Okay, terrestrial fauna, competition among animals, cooperation among animals. We can see that based on what the ecosystem and the timing of the environment's doing. Symbiosis, two organisms relating to one another. Okay, we see that often. Three forms: mutualism, mutually benefiting; commensalism, two dissimilar organisms living together with no injury; and parasitism, one essentially living off the other. We see examples: red-billed oxpecker riding on the back of a zebra, burrowing owl, underground burrow of prairie dogs, mistletoe attaching to vascular system of a tree. So we have zoogeographic regions, major realms of the world's land areas differentiated by different fauna. Okay, so we can kind of break these down into different regional aspects. Ethiopian region, most diverse vertebrate fauna. Oriental region, similar to Ethiopia, less diverse. Palearctic region, less diverse in Ethiopia and Oriental. High latitude of Eurasia and most North Africa and the Arctic. Very interesting. We also have neotropical, tropical portions of America with rich fauna. Madagascar, isolation from Africa, persistence of endemic groups. And then unique fauna dominated by birds, limited terrestrials, and no animals. In the Pacific region, we see more isolated, very limited fauna. So we can see the fauna, the vegetation, and plant life really varies by these regions, the diversity and so forth. In the Australian region, isolated to a large island, most distinct fauna with many endemic species. We have what's called the wall slide also in Australia, where the eastern side has Asian influence, whereas the western side has more Western influence as far as when we get into flora. So fauna is more consistent than the flora is in Australia. Okay, most biomes are named for dominant vegetation, also encompass fauna and interrelationships with soil, climate, topography. Tropical rainforest, here we see 20% of the world's oxygen and arguably about half of all the different species that exist in the world in the major Amazon rainforest in South America. Something I always talk about: world regional tropical deciduous forest. Here's a large example of that, South America, and we get into a little bit of Central Africa. Tropical scrub, we see some of that in north of South America. We see some of that in South Asia, a little bit Southeast Asia, and once again, a little bit in Central Africa. Tropical savanna, we see mostly in Africa and some in inland in north central South America. We see some in Southeast Asia, and then some in Micronesia, Melanesia, and the far right here of the map. And desert, we see quite a bit of that clearly in the Sahara, going through the north part of Africa. And then we see some within the mountain range on the west side of South America, some along our southwest, and then some inland on Australia, and then we see some inland in Asia and near Europe. Mediterranean woodland shrub, we see most of that on our northwest, and we see some of that around the Mediterranean, as the map shows us. Mid-latitude grasslands, we see some of that in mostly inland, mostly in our west central and North America, and we also see quite a bit in Africa as far as central along the forest, and then south of South America, and then we see quite a bit relatively inland in Europe and Asia. And deciduous forest, we see that very far north near the tundra region when we get to Asia, Russia, and then we see that mostly in Canada, northern United States. Then we see some milder forest areas as far as the broadleaf deciduous forest in South America, in Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and a little bit in Australia. Boreal forest, we see this mostly in the northern hemisphere, subarctic region, so that's really tundra, get into northern Europe, northern United States, and we also see that in Canada clearly. Okay, different types of direct influences of biotic relationships: physical removal of organisms, human habitat modification, introduction of exotic species. There's been a lot of human impact. How well defined, that's up for debate. Can have natural distribution patterns, could be loss of biodiversity related to soil erosion, water quality declining, agriculture productivity, and increased CO2. We see things like cattle ranching, commercial logging, human settlement, millions of acres of rainforest lost, which obviously we need to do to offset the CO2 in the environment and replace it with oxygen. And we have several places where we lost forest, mainly when we look in central South America, with the Amazon rainforest being 20% of the Earth's oxygen supply. And we looked at Borneo, where they basically cut down a lot of trees for palm oil plantations, which is Borneo's island near Indonesia, a very famous case. Then we have exotic species and invasive species that are basically like the pine beetle we had in Colorado, among other states, basically killed a lot of the pine trees, and then exotic species like certain regions like Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and Australia having species just to themselves. Now we've had a loss of biodiversity through some of this. Here's the Borneo example I talked about a couple slides ago, where we've lost quite a bit of forestry. Basically, forestry's been cut down. The wood's been used for as a natural resource for both building, mostly, some for fire, some kind of construction, furniture, building furniture, and it's also been replaced with palm oil plantations. Palm oil is the type of oil that can be used for a lot of different products, anywhere from cooking to fuel to many different reasons. But the bottom line is the loss of forest has impacted the environment.